Thank you for joining us today. In this presentation, Colin and I are covering the Advocacy Coalition framework. So let's begin by discussing some basics regarding the framework. First of all, who created it? That would be Paul Sabatier from the intellectual perspective and Hank Jenkins Smith, who brought experience. Sabatier spent years trying to develop this theory abstractly, and it wasn't until the early 1980s that he met Jenkins Smith, who had experience working with policy subsystems, that it all clicked. From their two perspectives, they worked together to develop the Advocacy Coalition framework because they believed other theories did not take into account other policy actors or the people and organizations that influence the policy-making process. Other theories merely reference the iron triangle, consisting of the common policy actors, which include legislators, interest groups, and the bureaucracy. This framework broadens participation, including other policy actors such as media members and more. Sabatier and Jenkins Smith also believe that previous theories relied too much on a linear progression, and instead, their framework they created delivers a more fluid model. So, what does it do? The framework, taking an ambitious approach to attempt to capture the entire policymaking process, aims to explain policy change or policy stability through the role of coalitions. This approach is the reason why the framework itself has evolved and continues to evolve over many years. The scope of the framework consists of questions regarding coalitions, learning, and policy change, and the framework itself can be applied to many areas inside and outside of higher education. Merit scholarships is one such application. Now that the basics are covered, we can discuss the details of the framework. On this slide, you'll see many assumptions that this framework proposes. First, the policy subsystem is the primary unit of analysis for understanding policy processes. So policy subsystems are related to a specific policy topic, and they contain a number of components and factors such as belief systems and political resources that interact to produce outputs and outcomes for a given policy topic. Policy subsystems are semi-independent but overlap with other policy subsystems, and these subsystems must have some sort of authority or potential for authority. Lastly, these policy subsystems experience times of stability, slow change, and major change. The second assumption is the set of relevant subsystem actors includes any person regularly attempting to influence subsistence affairs. This point assumes that there are more policy actors who influence the policy-making process outside of the iron triangle that we talked about earlier. So these actors can include scientists, researchers, private consultants, nonprofit organizations, news media members, and more. The third point talks about how individuals comprise the subsystems and they act within their own rational thoughts and belief systems to make decisions with the subsystem. And then the double shift refers to actors who demonize their opponents to rationalize their belief systems when they've experienced a policy loss. The fourth point talks about the effectiveness of subsystems coming together to form coalitions. And then the fifth and sixth point show us that policies do not occur just from the actions or inactions, but from how belief systems are translated. Also, scientific and technical explanations become a part of our belief systems too, and they are integrated with other forms of information. And then finally, the last point recognizes that understanding public policy requires looking at how policymaking processes change over time. So now let's flesh out a concept that we mentioned earlier, belief systems. This is central to understanding the framework. The definition as described by Ness is a set of basic values, causal assumptions, and public perceptions. Beliefs are classified under three types of beliefs based on the level of how easy or difficult it is to change your mind. So first, deep core beliefs are considered to be fundamental beliefs, part of who you feel you are to your core, and are therefore highly resistant to change. This could relate to your most inner belief that everyone has the right to an education. The second type, policy core beliefs. These are difficult to change, but they are not impossible to change. Change could occur due to changes in external events. So an example in higher education can involve favoring the right of access to higher education and believing that it is within the scope of government. An external event, such as a speech by Bernie Sanders, could change the mind of others who don't believe in college for all. Next, secondary aspects of belief systems. These are relatively easy to change. These include administrative rules and budgetary allocations. Though someone may not agree with college for all, they might agree with a proposed budget allocation that would expand access to some students, thinking, why not? Now to discuss advocacy coalitions more specifically. So an advocacy coalition is comprised of people from a variety of positions who share a particular belief system and who show a non-trivial degree of coordinated activity over time. Sabatier and Jenkins Smith propose 5 hypotheses regarding coalitions. First, on major controversies within a policy subsystem, when policy core beliefs are in dispute, the lineup of allies and opponents tends to be rather stable over periods of a decade or so. Evidence on this largely confirms that coalitions are generally stable over time, even if membership often changes. Second, actors within an advocacy coalition will show substantial consensus on issues pertaining to the policy core, although less so on secondary aspects. Additionally, they propose an actor or coalition will give up secondary aspects of her or its belief system before acknowledging weaknesses in the policy core. Coalition hypotheses 2 and 3 have mixed support. Some research has confirmed them, while some research has only found partial support for these hypotheses. At this time, they can't be rejected, but perhaps they should be revised after discovering how to best measure a belief system. And then researchers rarely test the fourth and fifth hypotheses, and support is mixed with some confirmations. More testing and redevelopments need to be made. So now on to Colin.
All right, so looking at policy-oriented learning. So this is looking at, there are a couple different factors that go into it, but policy-oriented learning plays a central role in belief change and reinforcing those beliefs. So the explanatory factors, first is the attributes of forums. So how the forum is arranged affects learning, and the more open the forum, the more likely that learning is to occur. So looking at level of conflict between coalitions, there's very little cross-coalition learning during periods of low conflict as well as periods of high conflict. So it needs to be somewhere in the middle in terms of level of conflict for learning to occur because people would be open to that new information. So looking at attributes of stimuli, so that is the type of information and experience that coalition actors are exposed to, and the attributes of the actors themselves finally. That includes their belief systems, their resources, their strategies, and their network contacts. Looking at that, there's two main learning hypotheses that we'll look at. So the first one looks more at learning across belief systems is more likely, again, when there's that medium level of conflict. So looking at that's kind of what that first one talks about. The second hypothesis talks more about learning across belief systems is more likely in a professional setting where it's more likely to be credible. So policy-oriented learning, the third hypothesis talks about basically when data is subjective, it's less conducive to policy-oriented learning because it's open to interpretation based on a certain set of beliefs. The fourth hypothesis looks at controlled experiments providing more evidence for policy learning. So again, it's not subject to as much of groups' beliefs or interpretations. Hypothesis 5, even if these are not changed by the information brought up in the process, they can introduce new perspectives that could lead to changes down the road. So moving on to policy change. So the first hypothesis, there's strong support in the research for this hypothesis, and basically this is saying that when any of the items talked about in the definition of the hypothesis occur, there's a challenge there when one of those things happens, but there is no policy change. So that is something that uses that. So when basically this is used in testing how a coalition uses an opportunity that occurred in the definition, uses that opportunity to either maintain the status quo or to seek a policy change. The second hypothesis is this one. There's varying support in the literature from very strong support to partial support. So this has only been tested a few times, and more research is needed to be certain of its impact. So looking at the diagram on this slide, this talks about the policy subsystem. So we'll look to the right for that. So this shows two coalitions, their beliefs, their resources, and their strategies, each are unique from each other. So these strategies are used to influence government decisions, and the decisions flow back into the subsystem up to the coalitions, but can also impact external events. So looking at the top left of the chart, that looks at relatively stable parameters. So these are the basic social, cultural, economic structures in a subsystem. Moving to the middle, these are the long-term coalition opportunity structures, and these establish how much of a consensus is needed for major change to occur. Stable subsystem is moving on to the short-term constraints and resources, short-term opportunity is basically for coalitions to exploit in the policy process. So some areas for future research from Jenkins, Smith, Norsted, Weibel, and Ingold. The first one is to reconsider the belief system in advocacy coalition framework. So being more specific and clarifying the distinction between policy core and secondary beliefs. Moving on to the next piece, advancing the theory and measures of learning. So this is something that is underdeveloped and there is room for more research. The third point, refining the theory of coalition structures and coordination. Fourth, developing a hierarchy for coalition resources. So this is arranging the resources by their perceived usefulness and effectiveness, and leading to further research on when certain resources are more important to gain influence. Looking at the next one, studying venues and forms within policy subsystems, using the Advocacy Coalition Framework for comparative policy research. So right now, very few studies are based on Advocacy Coalition Framework systematically, and very few studies focus on advocacy coalition framework systematically to compare policy subsystems, coalition behavior, and policy processes across political systems. So this is a gap in the research, and there's room to look at how coalitions learn from others' experience and how policies diffuse from one political system to another. So the next point looks at focusing on types of actors, including auxiliary and principal coalition actors, policy brokers, and policy entrepreneurs. So in this case, brokers play an important role in policy-oriented learning. Looking at the next piece, focusing on nascent and mature policy subsystems. So currently, most of the studies exist in looking at mature policy subsystems, and there are not a lot of pieces of research that look at newer policy subsystems. So that's an area for improvement. Next, expanding the understanding of science and policy analysis, so connecting these two fields and making more of an opportunity for an impact to be made. Establish common methods of data collection and analyses. So this is to establish a baseline to make it easier to use this framework and to examine how the policy subsystem works. And finally, explore the need for refinement in non-traditional settings. So making this a more universal policy. Again, this was something that has not been used a lot in the data so far, in the research so far. So these are a look at our sources. Note that two of the textbooks are the same textbook, just in a different version. Jenkins, Smith, Norsted, Weibel, and Ingold is the newest version of Sabatier and Weibel 2014.
Alrighty, thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.